to the beginning of my novel. I am sort of flabbergasted by all the emotions I'm feeling, actually, because when this idea began, which I'm going to tell you about in a moment, of working with this incredible source material about the orphan trains in America, I came here again and again. My husband and I bribed our 3 boys by taking them to Katz's Deli over and over, promising them those giant sandwiches and bringing them on multiple tours. And the sense of excitement and adventure that I got going on these tours was a huge propellant for me as I was writing. And in fact, today, when Kate and I were on this Hard Times tour, I don't know if any of you have been on it, but I had that same feeling, which I identify as this. When you're working on a novel, and I know there are some writers here, especially a novel like mine and like Kate's that involves a lot of research and a lot of moving parts, things that happen in real life and a lot of things that you invent. In a way, the research becomes like sort of figuring out how puzzle pieces fit together. And especially, but in the past, do I need to speak louder? Can I take this off? Oh, or you can hold that one. All right, I'm going to bring that one. Oh, okay. Especially, very loud. Especially when you're talking then about the book. In public, I've been all over the country. I've given, I don't know, 220 talks or more than that. And people always sort of ask questions and press certain areas, and it forces me to kind of articulate my understanding of what has happened in various social movements and things like that. And when I went on the tours of the Tenement Museum, I had those moments, those sparks of making connections and understanding how the orphan train movement fit into this great immigration, this rush of immigration and of immigrants to the Lower East Side, and then how they dispersed. And today, when I was on the Hard Times tour, I had a moment when the tour guide, who was phenomenal, said something that actually illuminated an aspect of something I always talk about that I had never quite put together. And I actually took notes on my phone. I just want to tell you what she said, because what happened when children were put on the orphan trains, which if you don't know about the orphan trains, I'll explain in a moment, but what happened was that they were often stripped of their identities. They were told, your life begins now, your parents are not your parents, your past is not your past, you need to forget the beginnings of my book, how it happened, where it came from, where the idea came from, and what the orphan train movement really was like, and then Kate will take over from there. And we're a little bit backwards because my character rides the orphan train in 1929, which is the final year that the trains were running. They went from 1854 to 1929. 250,000 children, 250,000 children, were sent mainly from Grand Central, mainly from the Lower East Side, some other states, but mostly from here, right here, to the Midwest. It was the largest migration of children in our nation's history. Okay, so it all began with this child. This is Hayden, my son, who at the time was 8 years old. We're in college. But as you can see, kind of a quirky child wearing his pirate costume and playing the piano. We were visiting my mother-in-law when this photo was taken, and she lives in Fargo, North Dakota. My husband's here. He grew up in Fargo. And it was the holiday season. It was exactly now. It was a month. It was December. And if you've ever been to Fargo at the holidays, or in fact, I think today, you will know that what happens when you go to the Midwest for the holidays is that there's a giant snowstorm and you're stuck inside during a blizzard, which is what happened to us. So 3 days of a blizzard. And I have 3 boys. Hayden was 8, Will was 7, and Eli was 3. And on the 3rd day, my mother-in-law, in desperation, pulled out this book. It's a centennial celebration of this small town of Jamestown, North Dakota. Really gone through it, actually. She stuck it on a shelf. It showed up in the mail. She stuck it on a shelf. But as she was leafing through it with Hayden, they came across this article. They called it Orphan Train, and it proved there was a home for many children on the prairie. Now, as I say, Carol grew up in this town until she was 18, and hundreds of children ended up in Jamestown from the orphan trains, and yet she had never heard of them. Furthermore, what's that?
It's before her time.
Before her time, but her father, so she had never heard of them. Her father was president of the Savings and Loan. He was a sort of stern, taciturn, quiet man. Never spoke about the past, but what she discovered is that he was featured in this article. And so was his brother, and so were their 3 sisters, 5 children who ended up in Jamestown, North Dakota, orphaned, and never spoke about how they had gotten there and what had happened to them. Now, as the mother of 3 boys, I'm not stunned that the boys might have kept quiet about it. But as the sister of 3 girls, I'm actually amazed that these aunts never said a word. Carol didn't go away to college until she was 18, so that's a long time. So this was just over a decade ago, and I was completely fascinated. I mean, I'd never heard about it before. My husband, Dave, was a history major at Yale. You'd think maybe somewhere along the way he might have heard something about this big movement, which I came to soon learn has been hidden in plain sight. But I also felt that not only was it a huge story, which was intimidating, there's so much, and I say hidden in plain sight because if you go to Amazon and you type in the words orphan train, not only will you see hundreds of books on the orphan trains, but you'll see at least 20 that have exactly that title. And people have written about it. Historians have written about it. Often survivors, train riders' children and grandchildren have written about it. But I felt like an interloper. I'm not a Midwesterner. I never went to the Midwest before I met my husband. It didn't feel like my history. I was afraid of stepping on toes. Of the 250,000 train riders, there are 3 million descendants. So there are a lot of people who care quite a bit about this story, even if most of us hadn't heard much about it. But I was fascinated. So what I do when I have an idea that I'm sort of working over is I start a file and I started throwing things into it. I had a Google alert. There would be articles in the Times or in the Washington Post about train rider reunions. I went to one of the Foundling Hospital. I flew to Ireland to do research. I wrote 2 other novels and a nonfiction book in the intervening 7 years. And then finally I had sort of run out of excuses. And I knew that it was a big project to take on, but I also knew about myself that I didn't want to write a historical novel exactly. It's a contemporary novel. It takes place in the present day. And the orphan train part is about a 91-year-old woman telling her story to a 17-year-old girl who comes into her life to do community service because she's in foster care and has stolen a book from the library. That's the premise. And that felt doable to me. I'm from Maine. I wrote about Maine. I wrote about what it was like to be a foster kid, a half Penobscot Indian in Maine. I grew up in Bangor, Maine, 10 miles from Indian Island, where my character, Molly, lives, grew up. So, but then, coming here to the Tenement Museum, I started to do research about the Lower East Side, and I started to really learn what it was like for those train riders. And this is a picture of Elizabeth Street, which is the street actually where my novel begins. It begins in the tenements, and as I was walking through that building today, by the way, if you go on any of the Tenement Museum tours, you will see the apartment that I describe in my novel because it is there. Right here. What's that? I don't know what the cross street is there, actually. I'm not sure. And this is probably recognizable to you, again, if you've been on a tenement tour. These are 2 different periods, 2 different apartments, but the feeling of what it was like to live in those apartments in the 1920s. Yes, that's right. And Kate lived in an apartment with, as she said, a bathtub in the kitchen. So I knew that I'm part Irish and part English. I'm both oppressed and oppressor, I came to find in my research. I wanted to write about an Irish person I discovered because the Irish had a particularly hard time of it, as you can see from these ads. Like the second one just says, wanted a girl of neat and industrious habits and an amiable disposition to take entire charge of 2 small children. no Irish need apply. These signs were everywhere. They were in saloons. They were in apartment buildings. It was really tough to be Irish, on top of being starved by the British during the potato famine and the horrible civil war that was happening as a result of the British wanting to take over. So then they would stagger off the boat and get here and realize that it was hard to get a job and hard to find a place to live and all of that stuff. So I really wanted to show what that was like. Here are children just loitering on the streets. I got access to, as Kate did as well, to the Lewis Hines collection, the Library of Congress, photos from the Children's Aid Society. There weren't many people taking photographs of poor people and children at the time, and you all have such wonderful books, resources of those as well. So Kate and I both used this as an inspiration, this picture. I'll let her talk more about it, but I'll just quickly say that when my character lived in New York City and is taking care of her younger sister, Maisie, this was a photo that I had pinned to my bulletin board because it was very much the sort of all the expressions you can see in her eyes, the hunger, the defiance, the fear, the trepidation, mistrust, everything was I wanted to convey. And again, in this one as well, this is another photo that I had. I always have, when I'm working on a novel, I have an idea board with lots of things on it. And for this novel, I had a wooden cross, a claddagh, from Ireland. I had a dream catcher that the Penobscot Indian tribe made in Maine. And I had lots of photos. I had lists of food that the Irish ate. I had quotes and poems. I had songs from the period. And I had photographs. And this is another photo that I had on the bulletin board because this guy was sort of a model for Dutchie, who's my defiant bootblack who ends up on an orphan train and gets, of course, indentured to a farmer who trades him for a pig, which, by the way, is a true story. And most of the stories like that in my novel actually happened. Here's quite an amazing thing, and I'm going to just rush through because I know I'm getting to you in a second. I'm almost done. When I began this book 4 years ago, there were about 150 living train riders, as they call themselves. And today there are fewer than 10. And they're all between the ages of about 95 and 105 years old. Someone just handed me a whole beautiful handwritten piece with photographs of a 102-year-old train rider who lives in Illinois, who's still alive, and, by the way, moved to the Midwest because people apparently live quite a long time there, from what I can see. So I feel so lucky to have stumbled on this idea at a time when I could interview 7 living train riders, and I've read over 300 narratives. There's a kind of Shoah project at a place called the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas. They have hundreds of stories, oral histories of train riders that they've been taking for many years. And so that helped me with my research. I saw this photo actually in a Tenement museum book as well. Did you know that there was a second Flatiron building down by City Hall? That's it. And these are newsies, and what I love about this photo is that they look like they're about 40 years old, don't they? These two. Children slept wherever they could. They slept on fire escapes. They slept on grates in the city. And here are some actual train riders, fairly well dressed, as you can see. These two chaperones took over 100 loads, 100 groups of children. Most trains held 10 to 30 children. And they would start, as I say, in Grand Central and some other ports on places, train stations on the East Coast, and make the round through the Midwest. This is a sort of odd photo, I think, because it is an unusually large group. It's strange that they're standing on top of the train. It's very posed, obviously. I've never quite gotten to the bottom of where this came from and why this happened. But a much more representative group is this one that I didn't discover till after I finished the book. This is in North Dakota, a group of train riders. Very popular crowd. Boys, 9 to 14, but were, of course, the most desirable because they could work in the fields. Interestingly, though, and sort of ironically, they were also the most complicated and difficult. Many of those boys had, first of all, been through a lot. They had joined gangs, they were pickpockets, they were manipulative, they perhaps even had been in and out of jail at that point. Many couldn't read, certainly couldn't read at grade level. A lot of them hadn't been to school. They had strong accents, or they didn't even really speak English. There were a lot of issues. And for those troubled children to be indentured to the age of 18 or 21 to farmers after they'd been free on the streets of New York was a pretty big thing. And as the National Orphan Train Complex says, we'd just gone through a civil war to abolish slavery, but the farms and shops still needed labor. Some of these children took the place of slaves. They were indentured or contracted. Adoption was not required. A family did not have to pay more than room and board. This is an actual certificate of indenture, and as you can see, as an apprentice, until such child shall arrive at the age of 21 years. Trains of all babies were called mercy trains, but generally babies rode on trains with older girls, and the age of the children was 2 to 14. At 14, you were aged out. So if you did the whole trip and you ended up back in New York and you weren't chosen, yeah, exactly, and you were 14 years old, you were on your own. And in fact, my husband's grandfather was 15, so he got off the train in Jamestown and had to find a place to live, food, and a job because no one would take him. He was too old. So I was going to write about a boy because of Dave's grandfather, but I ended up writing about a girl because I found that it was so hard to be a girl on the trains. The boys were most desirable. The babies were very desirable as well. Girls 8 to 14 were the last chosen. They were considered fallen women, a threat to the female of the household, often through no fault of their own. And furthermore, they had to be socialized. Unlike boys who could eat and live in the barn, they really were domestic help. They cooked, they cleaned, they sewed, and they took care of children mostly. So they were in the household. What this little girl, Alice Ayler, who, by the way, rode the trains the same year that my character did, says about her experience was, so she and her mother and siblings lived in a tent in a forest in upstate New York, surviving on green water and berries. After she was put on a train, she moved from family to family. She says, I was a hired hand without pay. I was told constantly that I had bad blood. I was always looking at my veins and wondering, what could be bad about it? Just like everyone else's. She had a really rough and difficult transition. This is another photo that was on my bulletin board. This little girl is a seamstress, which is, as I say, a common job for girls, and she inspired the first household that my character goes into. Vivian, Neve is her first name. Her name is changed to Dorothy, and then it's changed again to Vivian, which, by the way, was very common. When you adopt a dog from the pound, people often change the name of that dog, and that was sort of the mentality. And by the way, it was also common for these orphan train riders to be given the name of a child who had died. That happened too, and I described that in the book. This is actually the only photo I've ever found of the children lining up to board by height, and they were practicing in this photo. A typical poster, and this is the one that was these were in newspapers, and they were in city halls and train stations. And I quoted from this one in the book because I found it so poignant. It's a company of homeless children will arrive, and there are varying ages in both sexes, having been thrown friendless upon the world. So homes are wanted with farmers, and then this wonderful locution, being mostly of respectable parentage, they are desirable children and worthy of good homes. And the indenture provides for 4 months of schooling. Now, volunteers were supposed to look in on the children and enforce this, but that enforcement was spotty for many reasons. Children would go to farms that were far from towns. They would run away, or they would move. Families would move. And so, especially for farmers with those older boys who had little incentive to go to school to be made fun of when they weren't even reading at grade level or possibly couldn't even read, the children didn't want to go to school, and the farmers didn't necessarily want them to either. So it was hard to reinforce that. So this is an amazing document. When I stumbled on this, I was thrilled to see all of the orphan train riders went into most of the states. This is partial. It's only till 1910. It's only the Children's Aid Society. notice how many children went to upstate New York. I did an event in New York, and a woman in the front row who was like 94 said, I lived on a farm in upstate New York, and we always took in orphan train riders every summer. It was a huge farm. They would work the fields. We always took boys, and they just worked the fields. She said, they had the most marvelous time, those boys, working our fields. And I thought, I would really like to talk to those boys and hear their story. So this map reminds me, too, that in the course of my research, I found out that Dave's grandfather wasn't on a quote-unquote official orphan train. His train didn't come from New York. It came from Missouri. But children actually were sent all over the United States. They came from California to the Midwest. They came from Canada to the East Coast. They went from the Midwest to the East Coast. That was Native American children. There was lots of mobility with children being sent all over the place. Okay, so we're getting to the end. So as I've mentioned, the Irish had it really hard. Girls had a tough time of it, but it was worse by far to be a redhead. And for a while, redheads weren't even allowed on the trains. They were so unwanted. So this is an article from the New York Times in 1901, Foundlings Find Homes, Children Taken West, No Redheads Among Them. So 52 black, brown, yellow, and flaxen-haired children fill a special car. No redheads or children with freckles are among them. Redheads, especially those with freckles, are not easily placed in homes, even if their hair is of Titian and their freckles beauty spots. So they asked the traveling agent why this could be. And he says he's inquired all over the United States as to the reason and has invariably been told that redheads fight too much and have bad tempers generally. He says he does not believe this, but he finds it difficult to defeat a tradition that has stood for many generations, which I just think is fabulous. And especially when you consider that my two oldest children are redheads. So you can see I had quite an incentive for making my character a redhead. So besides being, I stacked the deck against her completely. Besides being Irish and a girl, I made her a redhead as well. And I really wanted to look at what it felt like to face that kind of discrimination. And so when I was talking to the boys about the book, we were sitting around the kitchen island, and their friends were there, and their friends were sort of making fun, doing that thing that people still do. It's sort of a funny joke to make fun of redheads. And Will said, well, I'm going to show you, Mom. I said, but this doesn't happen today. This really doesn't happen this way, does it? And so he just Googled redheads. And this kind of silliness stems from a very real prejudice. Even in Ireland, did you know that if a red-headed girl or woman walked by a ship that had not yet been christened, it was considered bad luck? In Ireland. So when I talk to school groups, this is a really interesting way to talk about prejudice and discrimination because, of course, they wouldn't think about that. So to end, this is the logo of the Orphan Train Riders of New York, which is in Minnesota. I am flying there tomorrow, actually, to do a Heartland Big Read, it's called. But this was the sort of ground zero of my own research. I met lots of train riders. I went to a number of these reunions. And I was amazed to discover that it all began in 1960. There was a great stigma about the train riders. People often didn't tell their stories. So in 1960, a woman was talking to her close friend, mentioned that she was a train rider, and the woman said, I think there's another woman like that. The two of them got together, and someone knew a third person. So these three women decided to put a notice in newspapers all over the Midwest, and they did. And in 1961, 9 people, this is not all of them, 9 people showed up in Wahpeton, North Dakota. 1965, Fargo, North Dakota. 1969, Little Falls, Minnesota. And from then on, these reunions grew and grew. The train riders, as I say, there was quite a stigma about riding the train, so a lot of them didn't even want their descendants to come. They were closed. But the descendants were so vociferous, and as I've mentioned, there were so many of them. And by the way, it wasn't until the descendants started becoming lawyers that the records began to be opened. And so the train riders' descendants eventually batted down the door, and now they're filled with hundreds of descendants, and of course many fewer train riders. So here I am at one of those reunions. 3 out of these 4 women are now dead. And so Tomorrow, not only am I at the Tenement Museum today, but tomorrow, as I say, I'll be in Minnesota, really having come full circle from the research I did for this book. And it's been quite an odyssey and a journey, and I'm just really grateful to the Tenement Museum for getting me started on it. So thanks. And to Kate.
Can I have the remote?
Yes, here's the remote.
I have to say, it is so great to see so many people out here on a freezing night. And I'm very grateful to this museum for the same reasons that Christina just articulated so wonderfully and emotionally, because we both have had the same feelings being here and seeing again where we began. I'm also really indebted to this person who I think of as my literary fairy godmother, and I'm very happy to be the kind of caboose on a runaway train, which is really what it should be. This book has really touched so many people, and I know that most of you have probably read Orphan Train, and that's why you're here, because it's such a story, and it resonates in past and present. What's really interesting is those 7 years, to me, is the 7 years that Christina was working on her other books and keeping her clipping file. I was working on one book, and it was My Notorious Life. I didn't know it was that. It was called Orphan Train. My file says Orphan Train. All the files in my computer say Orphan Train. And one of the reasons why Christina went first is that most of the slides of the early days of the children sleeping on steam grates, and the 30,000 homeless children who lived barefoot, some of them as young as 2 years old, on the streets right down here, are the slides that I have in my this is a short version of Christina's slideshow, and my version has all of those pictures of the kids in the Lower East Side and on the Bend. So this novel began with me looking at those pictures and coming here and living in having lived in an old tenement building and in an old 1890s brownstone. I'm very curious about New York City history. I still live here. And I began looking at those pictures of Jacob Riis, and I found the same young girl. And I was so riveted by the expression in her eyes and the sort of feral, protective, wounded face and the way she holds that baby that I began to write a story about her. And I imagined her as an Irish girl, a child of the streets, and I named her Axie Muldoon. One reason is because that I wanted her to be Irish is that I spent a lot of time with Irish people, and I'm a mimic. I love languages and dialect, and I am fascinated by the way we talk in New York. You know, it's the bump, da-da-dum, and there's the this and the that and the these and the those and the thems. Where does that come from? Because then when you listen to some Irish people, you hear them say the these. You know, in New York you say, are those your shoes? We say, are those your shoes? Are these your glasses? Are all yous going to the store? Like that. That's New York. But then when you listen to people from Ireland, they'll say, are all yous going to the store? Are these your shoes? And are those your glasses? And I kept thinking, where did we get that accent? Where did it come from? And I began to think, what would Axie sound like? And I wondered what would happen to her. And of course, I came upon this information about the orphan train, a story I had never heard. And so Axie gets swept up in this orphan train movement and separated from her sister and brother, as Christina so eloquently described, happened very often to these kids from the streets. And I was writing her adventures on top of trains and missing her mother and her mother's misadventures in childbirth. And I was finding all these gems of history, what the Tenement Museum calls the stories of ordinary people are actually extraordinary stories of extraordinary people that you might never have heard of in your history books. But thanks to places like this, we are really getting to know that question we all have when we walk on cobblestones or we see an old hitching post in the city. what was that like? You know, what was that like? So what would have happened to a child like this? I came upon, just stumbled, this woman. I saw her in a history book somewhere. The wickedest woman in New York. Anne Trau-Lohman, Madame Restel. Well, of course, you think it has something to do with sex. She's a prostitute. She's a madam. Well, she wasn't. But it did have to do with sex. She was also not French. She was an English immigrant. And she was notorious or infamous because she placed ads like these in the papers. She was one of hundreds of people who did so. These ads advertised lunar tablets for the relief of female complaint. And they would say things in euphemism like, Madame Restel, female physician, informs ladies that her pills are an infallible regulator of asterisk. Not to be used when asterisk. People understood that these medicines could cause a miscarriage. And this was, in some ways, these pills were known to work in all cases of stoppage or irregularity from whatever cause. So this was kind of the first information that people had, that women had, about the possibility of family planning. In the beginning of the 1800s, the birth rate was something like 7 live births per woman. By the end of the 19th century, it was only about 4. So something was going on. These pills were kind of dangerous. They were made of things like tansy oil or ergot of rye, which is a fungus that grows on grain. And people had noticed for centuries that cows who ate grain corrupted with this fungus would miscarry their calves. And women said, I'll have some of that. I'll try it. And it was dangerous, but in the right doses, the pregnancy could not survive. So Madame was advertising these so-called medicines, and if they didn't work, she would perform a pregnancy termination. She would do an abortion. But she also had a full-service operation. This is a picture from 1840 of her practice, and you see the pregnant women lined up in their veils and their big bellies, and there's Madame in her red scarf talking to a pregnant man. It's a cartoon, and she says, you know, have an ice cream and a hair tonic. That'll fix you. But the women are all talking about how they got in this situation. You know, Charlie promised me that it would be safe. And so she would deliver babies. She was a midwife who delivered babies. She had a lying-in hospital where women would spend their confinements and see their pregnancies to term. She would place children for adoption. She had wet nurses on hand. She dispensed birth control information and also birth control devices. And she got very wealthy doing this. So I'm reading about her and I'm thinking, how come I've never heard of her? She was always in the headlines and she was quite rich. Here is her house on 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. And she was always being written about in the newspapers, the shades of the most gaudy and the vulgar pattern, you know, in the windows. They were criticizing her if she went to drive her fancy carriage in Central Park. How dare she show her face because she was so scandalous. And yet women in Manhattan and all over the country really were sending away for her medicines and coming here for her services. And she was quite a trusted midwife. But she was also controversial. She was accused of a couple of murders. People thought that she was guilty of the murder of Marie Rogers, the beautiful cigar girl. Edgar Allan Poe actually wrote The Mystery of Marie Roget about this case. But she never really suffered any consequences, even though she went on trial. The wonderful trial of Caroline Ann Lohman was published as a pamphlet that sold millions, or maybe not millions, but many thousands of copies, the transcripts of this trial. And as you might guess, a lot of this ended up in My Notorious Life, because I kept reading and I discovered that she finally attracted the attention of this guy, Anthony Comstock. Many of you might know him as a crusader who started the Comstock laws, which made it illegal to send anything obscene through the United States mail. And that could be almost anything. But he was a religious Congregationalist, Connecticut crusader, a Puritan, who wanted to stamp out lust, and he started the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice under the auspices of the YMCA. And that U.S. postal law, the Comstock laws, resulted in the burning of about 400,000 pounds of books, the destruction of 4 million pictures, and 4,000 arrests of booksellers, editors, writers, journalists, midwives, doctors, art students, because of their trafficking in what Comstock thought was obscene material. And he was controversial himself. You know, George Bernard Shaw's play was almost shut down by Comstock, and he said, this is just Comstockery for smug, self-righteous ignorance. His tactics were, his tactics were underhanded. He would pose as a woman, writing to a doctor, saying, I've had 6 children, I'm ill, I cannot care for another child, do you have anything that can help me? And when the doctor would send her some information, he would swoop in and arrest her. And one of the people he arrested was Anne Lohman. He had said he was a husband whose wife had nearly died in childbirth, and could she help him? And could she help save his wife? And when he provided him a syringe and some information about how to use the powder she provided, he brought some reporters back the next day and some police officers, and she found herself in jail and was distraught. This was after about 4 decades of practicing as a midwife, etc., in Manhattan. And she was older and very concerned that the laws were changing, which they were, that the medical profession was changing, which it was. Women were being driven out of childbirth, labor, delivery, midwives no longer in charge, but male medical doctors moving in, childbirth moving into hospitals at that time. And meanwhile, Anthony Comstock bragged that he had driven 15 people to suicide. And Anne Lohman was so upset at what she thought was her prospect that she, the morning of her trial, April 1st, she got a knife and climbed into her very opulent bathtub and slit her throat. This was on April 1st. April 1st. I saw April 1st. Because so many New Yorkers believed that she had faked her suicide, that she wasn't dead, that she had substituted the body of one of her victims. They thought she had many, and had absconded, and she'd been seen in London, and she'd been seen in Paris, and she'd been seen in Boston. She was alive, and she was going to come back someday and reveal the secrets of all the powerful men whose wives and daughters and sisters and mistresses had been using her services all these years. And I thought, that would be a really good story. That would be a great story. But I'm not writing that story. I'm writing about this scrappy, foul-mouthed, irreverent, orphan-trained street kid who's growing up, and she's out in the Midwest, and she's still out in the Midwest. And what's going to happen to her? And I don't really know what's going to... I don't know anything about the Midwest. I got to get her back to New York. And and I kept thinking, that story, well, she would grow up to do that, wouldn't she? And she might share that profession and some of that history. And plus there's that incredible plot device that you'd have to figure out, how did she fake it? So this novel that I've written, My Notorious Life, borrows from Anne Lohman / Madame Rastell's notorious, lost to history story. And it's not Anne Lohman's life, it's Axie Muldoon's life. It's a story about a family. It's a story about looking for family. It's a love story, and it is a mystery. You have to figure out how she did it. And I don't know if we have time, but I could read about 2 minutes, not long. But I like to read because of the voice that I've heard for so long in my head as I've written, while Christina was writing 4 books. This one is mine, and this is just, you'll see how the elements might come together. In the very beginning, it's the first chapter. It's when Axie is an old woman, and she's looking back on her life. And the way this comes out is Irish. I said I was a mimic, so forgive me. It's an Irish voice. Chapter 1. Confession. It was me who found her, April 1, 1880. The date is engraved on my story, same as it is on the headstone, so cold and solid there under the pines. What happened that morning hurts me to this day, enrages me still, though many years have passed. The time was just before dawn. She was there in the tub. It had claw feet, gold faucets. Marble was everywhere in that room, so magnificent. A French carpet, a dressing table, candelabra, all deluxe. Well, I knew something was wrong right away. When I knocked, I knew. There was not no noise of bathing, just that slow drip, that plink of water landing on water. So dreadful. I went in, and there she was, a scarf of red across her shoulders and down her chest. The water was red and cold, with all her life leaked out. My hands were trembling. Terrible sounds strangled in my throat, quiet, so as not to wake the house. Oh, Mother of God, she was dead. I collapsed down at the vanity, reeling and caning. I couldn't look, but I had to. The scene was reflected so clearly in the mirror, and strange how it was serene almost. She seemed at rest. The way her hair fell, you did not see the red cut. She was a bather in a painting, so peaceful. But I hated her for what she'd done to herself, even after how I cared for her so long. She would be my undoing now, too, not just her own. Who would believe a suicide? They would say I killed her. They'd write me again in the headlines as murderess, hag of misery. How they'd lick their chops. They'd come for me with their shackles and their oakum and their lies and put me away for good, unless by some conjurer's snap I could get her poor corpse out of the water and away down the stairs and out to Fifth Avenue to disappear. It was the very morning of my trial. I was due in court in 3 hours. What could I do? What would happen to me now if I could change places with her? The thought came to me. If only it was me dead there in the water. I imagined it, picking up the knife. My troubles would end. I'd not be a grief to anyone. These ideas raced now through the panic. And I looked again in the mirror at a reflection over my shoulder, and I seen, all of a sudden, how it wasn't a bad resemblance. Our age was close enough. That black hair. And it was the mirror that morning, the way we were doubled in it, that showed me the way to my escape. I know most of you have read Christina's book, so I hope that it will give mine a chance. And we have time to answer questions, I believe, and thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and Laura and Annie, we really happy here.
So before we open it up to the audience, I just wanted to kind of start things off with a few questions that I'm curious about after reading both of your books. At this museum, we are kind of always trying to connect past and present. And Christina, your book, because it is a contemporary book that's looking back on the past, does that really clearly. But I think it's so interesting that both of you were inspired by this image, but you took her in very different directions. You have this Midwest story, you have a very New York story, but there's still a lot of similarities. And one of the things that I see that's really similar is the idea of how we decide to help people, the idea of assistance and who's responsible for helping those people. And in the terms of your book, Christina, helping children, child welfare, and Kate with you when it comes to women's health. And I'm just curious, during your research, did you see those ideas evolve over time? How have you seen that, the idea of how to help children, women's health, how's that changed over time?
I'll start and then pass it on to you. First of all, don't you want Kate to read you the whole book now? Yeah. I know, right? We could do a whole marathon. I would be up for it completely. How many times have we done this? I still love hearing that.
We love hearing each other. Words of mutual admiration.
I'm going to answer it in a way that probably is not exactly an answer to your question, but I've been thinking about this a lot because my character in the past, as you know, rides an orphan train and is abandoned. And at one point, we were talking about this before we came out, actually, my novel was called The Almost Orphans because both Neve, or Vivian, the orphan train rider, and Molly in the present day have a living parent. And only about 30% of the orphan train riders were actual orphans. Most of they were abandoned. They were taken out of homes. They were actually taken out of homes. They were plucked off the streets, and they were runaways. And the journey of how they got to the orphanages and then got onto the trains was often very complicated. But what I realized, actually talking to foster care workers and also people who've been through foster care themselves, people who've taken in foster children, which is what I wrote about in the present day, is that the problem of unwanted, of disenfranchised, abandoned children will never be solved. It's a completely different world now, and thank God it is. There are social programs, there are welfare, there's foster care, there are social workers, there are checks and balances, there are laws to protect poor children. But the emotions that children feel today in the foster care system are identical to the ones that the children felt who were abandoned and put on an orphan train. And that sort of depth of feeling, the connection between my characters in the present day and in the past was built on that, the understanding that both of them knew exactly what it felt like to not be wanted, not have a home, and not have anyone who would take them in, and to feel that they were treated like, as the train riders said, like refuse, like garbage on a barge, been sent to find their own way. And so I found that actually a sort of profound realization. I gave a presentation right after my novel came out to a group of 60 social workers in Newark, New Jersey, which, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, is like the epicenter of social work. It's the very hard place to do social work. And one said, we don't send children on orphan trains anymore, but we send them across the state 4 hours to a community they've never heard of, to a family they didn't ask for, people they don't know, and psychologically, it's not that different, the situation, for the children themselves. And so anyway, that's my observation.
Yeah, I think that what Christina is saying, and I think one of the reasons her book has resonated with so many people, is that she's really captured those emotions, and that it's really illuminates the way history informs fiction, which can carry the emotion of history in a way that most history books can't do. These ordinary lives, what must it be like? So we live with Molly and Neve and Axie too in this feeling. And so the same thing was true for me, that writing about a child in the 1850s living on the street, and experiencing what a child would experience, what would she grow up to feel? I think she would either become very hard or she would be motivated by mercy. And the question, especially in this era, is when social reformers really began to ask, what is society's responsibility to poor people and to children? Children were little grown-ups. And suddenly they began to be seen as defenseless. And this did, the Children's Aid Society, the Orphan Train movement became the Children's Aid Society, became foster care system. And in some ways, in many ways, we're still stuck there. But it seemed to me that with so many homeless children whose mothers had died in childbirth, many of them, that the profession of midwifery and the profession that Anne Lohman chose, and when history really painted a terrible picture of her, I was very put off when I first started to read about her. But then I began to see that really she was motivated by mercy and that she was helping women where nobody else was helping women. She was administering reproductive health care, which is what we call it now. It was all asterisked out for centuries because of shame. And the same shame that Christina talks about, where children can't say they were adopted, where children have to change their name. They can never talk about their origins or that they were poor. This shame surrounded all of female matters. And so that question of mercy and how those notions came out of this era and began to evolve for women's health and for children too, I think these histories are starting to emerge in a really rich and important way. So more questions?
So what I'm going to ask you all, since we're live streaming this, we want to make sure that your voice gets picked up on our live stream, that you come up to the microphone where Ellie Shev is standing to ask your question, and that way we can all also see and hear the question that you're asking. So if you all wouldn't mind coming up, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mary Lou. I enjoyed listening to you talk because you come from different perspectives, so that's very interesting. That madam, like when she killed herself, how old was she? Did she ever marry or have children? I know she was there to help people.
Madame Restel was in her late 60s when she died, but my character is, when she makes her escape, is in her 30s. So I did take great liberties with the history. I collapsed events and times and changed names because I felt much more free as a novelist to be able to do that. But yes, the real immigrant, Anne Lohman, came from England, Gloucestershire, England, here with a husband who quickly died of bilious fever, whatever that was, and left her with a child. And then she remarried a man named Charles Lohman, who was a printer and a free thinker and hung out in dangerous bookshops. And it seemingly helped her learn her profession, but nobody really knows.
So her children inherited her mansion when she died. I mean, she killed herself, right?
Yes. The question is, did her children inherit the mansion when she died? I think she left. When she died, she was maybe one of the richest women in the country. But her descendants, I haven't tracked, and I don't know what happened to them. They moved to Long Island, I think. It's the last I heard. So many descendants too. People are shy; they don't want to come out.
Like real life stories, Realist. Yeah.
Well, I have another question then. Both of you kind of mentioned this in your respective presentations, and I'm just curious if you have an answer to why people don't know these stories. Like, why have we never heard of Anne Lohman? Why are people surprised to hear about the orphan trains when there are other things that we're made aware of? There are other histories that are more common. Why are these stories so unknown?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll just answer this for me, and then I'll pass it along. There are a number of reasons people don't know about the orphan trains, and it was sort of a detective story for me to figure them all out. But the bottom line is that the history of our country is not the history of the poor and the dispossessed. That's at root of all of it. On top of that, there was this shame that I mentioned that the orphan train riders felt, that they were made to feel, and many of them never spoke about it. But I think the most shocking thing I discovered in my research is actually another big part of it, which is that, I don't know if any of you have read Temple Grandin's work. She's a writer with Asperger's who's written about animal and human psychology. And one of her findings is about how to get cattle to the slaughterhouse so that they won't stampede, so that they'll go in an orderly manner. And she's discovered that if chosen randomly by whoever came along, there was no screening process. So imagine you're, say, a 6-year-old boy, okay? You're a 6-year-old boy, you get on the train in Grand Central, you go to Chicago, Union Station, you get out, line up by height, a farmer picks you out of the lineup, you go 3 or 4 hours in a vehicle of some kind, a buggy and then eventually a car over these 75 years, to the middle of nowhere as far as you're concerned. You're on a farm. The train you were on had maybe 15 children, right? 10 to 30 children, 15, 20 children. Chances are you'll never see another child that you rode on that train with for the rest of your life. And the people who take you in don't tell anyone that they took in a train rider, because, as I say, there was a stigma. So the people who took in train riders would say they got them from neighbors, they got them from a relative who was doing poorly. So you'd go to this farm, you're on your own, you're 6 years old, and after a while, and no one says anything, they don't talk to you about it, you don't talk to them, you're not allowed to talk about the past, it doesn't exist. And after a while, you start to think, did I imagine it? Did I dream it? Or even simply, I can never speak about this. So the realization I had that was so mind-blowing was 250,000 children sent to the Midwest, and most of the children who rode on the Orphan train thought that their train was the only one. So that is a big reason that we don't know more about it, and why, as I showed you in the slideshow, people only began to piece it together as adults, and sometimes because their children said, why do you have no birth certificate? Why do you look nothing like anyone else in the family? Or even, why do you have a funny accent? I mean, some of these train riders were old enough that they would still have vestiges of an accent. So it was quite an interesting thing to discover that.
Yeah, I echo everything Christina just said, and I'll just say, in answer to that question, an anecdote. When I was in 8th grade, my 8th grade teacher, Mr. Kline, asked me, "Do you like history?" "No," I said. "Why?" he said. "Because it's boring, it's battles, it's memorizing dates, it's acts of this and acts of that, and kings and presidents, and there's no girls in it." And he said, "Girls never did anything important." And I said, "Okay, yeah, I guess you're right. I'll be an English major." But now we see that generations are starting to have a different attitude toward history. Americans have a sort of ahistorical personality. There's an anti-historical streak to us. But decades of women's studies, of cultural studies, of ideas that we must respect these stories that we hear at this museum, extraordinary stories of so-called ordinary people, are fascinating. And so with this wealth of scholarship, it's a very rich time now to start hearing these stories. But the shame and the ahistorical nature of our national personality, I think, has a lot to do with it. You know, that we don't know the story of the laborers who started labor unions, et cetera, et cetera. There are many lost stories just waiting to be found and have novels written about them. A ringer.
These children were completely cut off from their past. When you interviewed them when they were older, did any of them indicate that they had tried to connect with their original families? Had they tried to see where they came from?
You know, a number of the descendants of the train riders have spent their lives doing this. And if you go to an orphan train reunion or a train rider reunion, you see these people with 3-ring binders filled with material, and they're all exchanging information, and they're coming to the foundling and the the Children's Aid Society reunions. They're doing all this work. It's generally generationally 1 or 2 steps beyond the train riders themselves, because the vast majority of train riders not only never came back to the East Coast, most of them not only stayed in the states they were put into, they actually stayed in the small communities they were put into. And as one train rider said to me, I had been through so much turmoil, I just wanted to stay put. And I think a lot of them felt that if they could just, there's something about those small conservative Midwestern communities that were so difficult to break into, eventually for many train riders became safe havens. And I think that sort of locating a place and just anchoring, settling down there was a priority for a lot of them, having been through so much. But subsequent generations then did take on that task. And the truth is, it's really hard. As I said, birth certificates were altered, destroyed, and locked up. And I've looked at birth certificates where they had crossed out all the identifying characteristics so that no one could ever find, who the family was originally. And most train riders never did trace back to their origins.
The Aid Society didn't keep records of those children? Not for a long time.
I'm curious about whether the children remembered their life in New York.
And you can talk to this too. There was a process of forgetting that was institutionally sanctioned, that they wanted the children, they thought it was healthier at the time. There was no therapy, of course. And they thought it was healthier for children to forget. So they were sort of forced to forget. When you look at Amazon, as I mentioned, the dreaded Amazon, and you look at all of these books about the train riders, the orphan trains, you can see that lots of them are self-published by descendants, asking specific questions and getting stories out of their relatives. So I think once descendants started asking questions, a lot of train riders began to tell what they knew about their pasts. But for a lot of them, they had been told for so long that they weren't supposed to remember. They were supposed to let it go. That it was very psychologically complicated. And I did an event, I won't ever forget this. I was in Signal Hill. I've done a lot of events in the Midwest, and there are always descendants of train riders. But I was in Signal Hill, California, which is where the movie There Will Be Blood was about. It's a very wealthy community, lots of oil money. And there were 4 descendants of train riders in the audience, which I was flabbergasted by, because that usually doesn't happen outside of the Midwest. But apparently there's even a name for it, the trail of Midwesterners who go to California. And one by one, it started a whole conversation I'd never had with descendants before about their parents. And the first woman who stood up said, my mother was a very cut off, difficult person. She was traumatized, and she passed that trauma on. And as they stood up, they sort of said, yeah, I dealt with the legacy of that kind of experience as well. And so there was actually that too. And certainly with my husband's grandfather, the way his mother, Carol, describes him was that he was just very shut off, very emotionally tamped down. And I think that's a long answer, but I think that's what happened to a lot of them.
I think some of that is generational too, but I just have to say that one of the things fiction can do, and that Christina's book does, is, and I hope that I know I tried to do it too, is to imagine yourself into the mind of one of those kids, and we if you've read Orphan Train, you really feel what that was like, and that's the thing about fiction and the way it carries emotion and story and specificity. And I was so impressed when we were both delighted when we were upstairs looking at these rooms at the level of detail and texture that the guides were pointing out in these rooms that were so just 40 layers of paint and linoleum and artifacts and the hands going down this mahogany banister, thousands of hands of all the people who've lived in this building. And those are the kinds of details that that I know both of us are really in love with as storytellers, because that's what makes the past come alive. It isn't those dates and battles and important, acts of this and that, although they're of course quite relevant. But I think what we share is the ways to look at in which people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them, to paraphrase James Baldwin. I think that's what good novels can do, and they can bring history alive in a way that makes it relevant to now.
Can I just say one more thing? I just want to say one more thing, which is that I didn't know Kate. Her publisher sent me her novel, and I saw My Notorious Life, and I didn't know it had anything to do with the orphan trains at all. It doesn't really say that exactly. And I opened it, and I started reading it, and I was so flabbergasted by how gorgeously written, you've heard it, how gorgeously written it is. And I thought, this is so much better than my novel. And I have to meet this person. I have to. So I completely stalked her, and I forced her to do things with me, and so that's how this all happened, is that it wasn't like we were friends before. It was that I recognized that she had done such a deep and meaningful job with this material that I was flabbergasted. And by the way, that's one of the joys of being a writer, is to see people take the same material that you've been wrestling with and do something entirely different that's even way better. It's really exciting, actually.
Not as nice as Christina is, but I would say... Because really, when I heard this book, Orphan Train, I just went, ugh. She can't. That's my story. But then I met her, and then I read the book, and I was, it was exactly what you said. It's just a beautiful story that really carries you, and you think, wow, there must be a million more stories on that train, on those trains too. So we're very lucky that we found each other. We have. One more question. Oh, that's the microphone for you.
So you mentioned that sometimes these children were plucked from the street. Yes. Have you thought about writing a book about the parents who went looking for their children?
Well, Charles Loring Brace, who was really the brains behind the orphan train movement, he was a minister in the 1850s who came down from Connecticut to make it his mission to save New York City street children. He would go to Bandit's Roost and the Bend and Misery Row, and he would go see children living in just abject, horrible conditions, and he would take them. He would send them out on trains or bring them to the Newsboys Lodging House. And so that's part of the story. Charles Loring Brace is a character in My Notorious Life, and seen from the eyes of a child, he doesn't come off well, but of course he meant well. This was what Laura was talking about. This was the beginnings of attempts to deal with poverty. It was the first organized attempts here. So that is a good story, yeah. The parents figure, too, in looking for their kids. Some of them would put their kids on these trains thinking they'd see them again. Oh, you're going to have a better life. You're going out to green grass, and everybody will have pie and pony and a good fresh air, get away from the tenements, the disease and the bad nutrition and the swill milk that the kids were drinking. Go out to the country and you'll have a better life, but then come back. But they would never find their kids again. So.
And many of them actually attached. I went through an archive of letters and note at New York Public Library of letters and notes that parents attached to their children that were taken by the chaperones and the nuns and put away and were never shared with the children, say with their addresses and their names and how to find them again, and that we want you back. And parents would show up at the Children's Aid Society and the Foundling and ask for their children. Once the decision was made to put a child on a train, that was it. It was done. And there was no turning back. Parents would show up at the train station even wanting their children back, and they were not allowed to. So it was crazy that way. When we think about it now, it seems insane, and yet it was seen as healthier for the children.
But isn't that somewhat analogous to what's going on with the kids coming over the border?
She's saying, isn't it analogous to the border children? Yes, I just posted on my Facebook author page an editorial comparing the orphan trains to the border children. Very similar in a lot of ways. I mean, what we old immigrants tend to forget is that every immigrant group that comes to this country goes through a hazing process and has a difficult time of it. And, it's happening today. And by the way, if you're interested at all in this story of the orphan trains, it's happened all over the world, and there are still children on trains being sent all over the place in other countries. And there's a similar program like the orphan trains that went through the late 1960s. The British government ran it. It wasn't until the 90s that the late 90s, that they finally admitted that they had done this, sent children on ships to Australia into Catholic workhouses where they were terribly abused. There's a movie called Oranges and Sunshine, starring Emily Watson, that is about the crusader who uncovered what happened in England, an almost identical program. And at the end of the movie, the actual woman comes on and talks about what she found. And it's quite powerful, actually. 1910.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming and sharing your stories. I'm glad that we could be an institution that inspires you, and your interpretation of history continues to inspire more questions for us. So thank you, Christina Baker-Kline. Thank you, Kate Manning, for being here. You all, thank you very much for coming. I hope you come back to the Tenement Museum, support us. I want to thank Con Ed for supporting this program and allowing us to have a free program like this. We wouldn't have the lights on, literally, I guess, without them. But Kate and Christina are going to be up here signing books. There are books for sale. And tonight they're both, My Notorious Life and Orphan Train are 15% off. So get a book and come up here and have them sign them. But thank you very much for coming.